listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Today's Rootbound is brought to you by celery, the true star of ants on a log. Celery, it's aromatic.
Hi there. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Rootbound. My name is Steve, and we have quite a spirited episode for you today. And by spirited, I mean spirits. Yes, that's right, alcohol. And so before we talk to our guest today, I thought I would talk about that connection between plants and alcohol, because all alcohol starts with a plant. Think about it. What's your favorite drink? Wine? That's grapes. Beer? That's wheat or barley. Cider? That's apples. Yes, all alcohol starts with plants. But how do we get from plants to alcohol? It has to do with a process called fermentation. Now, fermentation is actually a big topic that has lots of processes involved, are kinds of fermentation, but the general definition of fermentation is a chemical breakdown of a substance by microorganisms. And in this case, we're talking about yeast, and yeast break down the sugars from plants and turn it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So if you ever had the experience of brewing something yourself, it's a really fun and kind of magical experience when you mix all these things together and then all of a sudden you start getting these bubbles, right? And that's the CO2 that the yeast are creating. But they're also at the same time creating alcohol. And over time, the alcohol concentration of that product goes higher, and it's very exciting. That's what fermentation is, and if the next time you have something to drink, thank some yeast, but also thank a plant.
To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems.
Hi, Chantal. How's it going?
It's good. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing good. Did you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, I wanted to share my love for the wormwood plant.
Wonderful. I can't wait to hear about this from you in particular.
Cool. Well, I mean, I can start telling you about wormwood.
Yes, please. And also why it's meaningful to you.
Oh, okay, sure. So wormwood is a misunderstood plant, and you know me well enough to know I have a soft spot for the underdogs of the spirited and green world, if you will. And wormwood, of course, has an association as being the key component to absinthe.
Yes.
And I'm a huge fan of absinthe. And so wormwood, its Latin name is Artemisia absinthium. I know I was going to say that wrong. Absinthium.
Mispronouncing Latin names is a theme on this podcast.
Cool. I just want to be a part of it. You know, I want to be part of the greater community of what you do. That's great.
Yeah.
So Artemisia absinthium, the term, of course, harkens back to the goddess Artemis of the hunt and the forest.
Oh, yeah. I didn't ever think about that, actually.
Yeah. That's another, of course, key thing I love so much about the wormwood and all of its little connections. Its connection to absinthe, its connection to its story. It's a pungent, sort of a bitter, silvery herb that loves the Mediterranean weather and climate, but can also be grown in different versions because there's many different variations of it. So also like in the Alps, right, in the mountainous regions where it gets more scrubbier and bush-like. And then that kind of gets associated with this other cool liqueur called Genepi. But wormwood is the key, like, bitter herb that has an amazing variety. But the grand wormwood that I was just specifically referencing in absinthe, the Artemisia absinthium, is pretty specific. It's the key component for absinthe, not for Genepi. And it's something that I've learned more and more about. I've learned some myths and saw how through history it's been misunderstood. So that's where the love comes from.
Very, very good. I'm thinking now, I'm also a big fan of absinthe, which you also know.
I do know.
And I have been thinking, though, I don't think I've ever seen an absinthe plant in real life. And one, have you? And also, if you have, or if you've just looked it up, can you describe the plant? I don't think I actually know what it looks like.
Oh yeah, well, I don't think I've had like an actual absinthe plant because I don't live in an area. We don't live in an area where the true like Artemisia absinthium grows, but there are certainly other variations of wormwood that grow around and that are local. I know that they're in Virginia. But it's kind of got like a silvery green hue to the leaves, and the photos I've seen of them are just sort of this like tall growing like grass plant thing, not grass, but it has the leaves that sprout out, and it has like the silvery green hue, and they flower, right? So they have like little white flowers. I don't know how else. I don't know if I'm describing it better.
No, that's okay. I'm sure people are Googling as well as we speak, because that's also a theme. Yeah, I think now that I think about it, I remember actually now. It just came to me. I have a plant in my backyard that is called mugwort,
Yes.
which is also an Artemisia, and I think they look kind of similar. So yeah, it's like a smallish bush, pretty leaves, but yeah, the leaf shape, I don't know. Google it, everybody.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
there are many little tiny fronds. I don't know. I'm not good at
Yes.
descriptions, apparently.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm trying to do in this podcast, to learn a little bit more about like the botany descriptions, but it's hard. There's a lot of vocabulary, and like just describing leaves alone,
Yeah.
like it's a whole thing.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, do you have some fun facts and dazzling details about wormwood?
Oh, sure. Well, we can first start about the fact that it's the main component to true absinthe, and what it adds to absinthe is so much aroma and bitterness and sort of this little mentholy quality, and just there's of course the other trio includes green anise and fennel, and those are the main. There's other herbs that get added, but another fun fact has to do with the Artemisia, the Artemis goddess of the hunt, and how she has a story where she actually rides through the forest and provides Chiron, the centaur doctor dude. I don't know if you remember mythology. with Artemisia absinthium for like this healing medicine. It's like one of the key things in the stories. And so throughout history, like much older than absinthe, the first recipe of absinthe, which is more around the 1700s, but is the infusion of wormwood into wines and into liquids. So there's like teas, but also just sort of the beginnings of that like aromatized style of wines. Wormwood was a very old component, not just in Europe, but also like in China and down further south and in like northern Africa and other places. So it's kind of got like a really long history of medicinal purposes.
Very interesting. I did not know that. Maybe going back a little bit for our audience, because I think we're on the same page when it comes to absinthe. But maybe you could just like tell us a bit more about absinthe. Like, what is it?
Oh,
And
yeah.
why is it so cool and interesting?
So absinthe is a high proof spirit that originated in Switzerland and France, and there's a lot of different variations. But the true absinthe is a distilled spirit that is very high proof, and it's high proof because, as I mentioned earlier, the trio of herbs that get macerated and then distilled into the distillate are they need a high proof alcohol to stay dissolved. Otherwise, they're just not. They won't stay in solution. So you need really high proof, and so the spirit that comes out of it is called absinthe, and it came from Grand Wormwood Artemisia absinthium. I'm saying that wrong. Absinthium. Fine.
Yeah.
So when you add water and take down the solution, then you undissolve the herbs of the spirit, and that process is sort of the lushing effect. So you water down the absinthe to let the oils, the essential oils, dissolve out of its solution, so it becomes colloidal and cloudy, which is what louche translates into, and then it becomes something that you sip, and it's full of herbal notes. Often the most prevalent note is licorice from the anise seed, the green anise, but the wormwood adds a lot of sort of these bitter qualities, and there's a little bit of a menthol, but there's just like a general herb greenness to it, and then there's the fennel, among other macerated herbs that get added later. It's got lots of history. Absinthe was considered poisonous, but it was really just a giant political campaign by the temperance movement and the wine movement, like the wineries that were going through a terrible time in the 1800s with phylloxera, devastating vineyards. And when absinthe was coming out of that, being really popular, they were not so happy that it was getting so popular. People were like, "Wait, no, come back to wine." And so there was like politics involved, and so it kind of distorted the image of what absinthe was, which was said to be hallucinogenic, when in fact the the chemical that is associated with this fantasy of it being super hallucinogenic is called thujone, and the amounts of thujone that are naturally in wormwood are tiny, and that it's just a matter of if you have a ton of this, like a ridiculous amount, which is not something we'd ever do, then it could be a neurotoxin, a poisonous neurotoxin, and cause like liver damage and seizures and kill you. But it's just kind of like a lot of things are not actually harmful unless you have them in super high concentrated doses. That's kind of what poisons, the nature of the variety of poisons, right?
That reminds me of two things. One, going back to episode 5 of our podcast, which is about lavender, we talked about the Swiss physician and alchemist named Paracelsus, and he's the guy who coined the phrase, the dose makes the poison.
Yes.
And I think that's very true with wormwood. And it reminds me, when I first learned that fact about, I always heard that wormwood was hallucinogenic, and that's why absinthe was banned, which is totally false, as you just described. But then I learned that, if you were to hallucinate from the wormwood in absinthe, you would be long dead from alcohol poisoning before that, I think is the case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's just so much history there, which I could get into. I do teach absinthe classes for anyone who wants to hire me. I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. We can tease some of that stuff here. You don't have to go. I know that we could do a long time on the history of absinthe for sure. And I've taken one of those classes. It's very fun. That's interesting. Do you have any other interesting facts about wormwood itself?
This one's kind of fun, just because I don't think anyone knows this. So technically, wormwood, which contains that thujone, was never, even though it was just a misunderstanding, while it was banned in the U.S. and Canada in 1912, technically it was only the levels of thujone that were banned. But at the time, they didn't have the proper measurements or understanding that there was so little thujone that technically absinthe was never banned, because it never actually had.
Oh, wow.
Just the idea of it was banned. So, I mean, you couldn't just get it and drink it. You would be arrested because you couldn't prove that there was actually not enough thujone. And it was only discovered because in the 1970s, some folks were like, I wonder if that thujone is related to THC. And so some people did some experiments and found out, oh no, they're not at all related. THC being like the cannabis chemical in marijuana, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, then now there was a door that opened about, oh, maybe we can understand the chemical structure, what this is. And then that got shelved again until the 2000s. And then they were like, oh, there's really not a lot of thujone in this. So technically, the band never really existed, if you want to get really lawyery about it, technically.
Very interesting. Yeah, I remember the first time I visited Switzerland. I used to live in Switzerland, and my wife was there, and she lived there before me.
Right.
And the first time I visited her, absinthe was still illegal in the United States, or apparently it wasn't, but it was the impression that it was illegal. And I remember how cool I felt bringing back a bottle of absinthe, somewhat surreptitiously, to the United States. But then pretty shortly after, it became legal, and it wasn't as cool anymore. But yeah, I had my own little personal journey with absinthe of learning about it and going down the rabbit holes of it, and having it in the Czech Republic, which is actually not real absinthe for the most part, which is a whole other thing that you can learn in Chantal's class about it. But this whole thing about lighting it on fire is kind of a weird thing. We don't have to get into that now. But then my thing is I wanted to find the absinthe that was apparently the most like absinthe pre-ban, because it was also banned in Europe for a long time, right? And there is this kind of thing of how has the recipe been held onto through that period of banning. And I found this one, which I don't know if you're familiar with, that was called Nouvelle Orleans or Nouvelle Orleans or
Yeah.
And I'd read at the time, this was 2006 or 5, that one particular one was the most like the pre-ban absinthe. And so Carla and I tracked it down in this bar in Paris that served it, and it turned out to be a heavy metal bar.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, but it was a really cool experience. They had these these special little like cup things for like doing the dripping of absinthe. Which if people aren't maybe you could explain that real quick about this dripping method of preparing absinthe.
Oh, yeah. So, as mentioned before, absinthe, which has different herbs macerated and distilled and into this macerated into the recipe, and then it's later distilled as a spirit. When you add the water, the different oils will come out at different rates of dilution. So, if you drip slowly, you get a slow release of all the oils, and then they kind of come and harmonize. And so that's sort of where the absinthe drip, the watering down, comes into, because you're letting each oil slowly bloom into fragrance in your glass. And so there's lots of tools, right? So now you have a fountain, you can have a nice spoon, and there's a whole artistry and craft behind all of these different tools. There's something called a brouilleur. It's like a little seesaw dripping method. I have one of those. Those are great. And then the glasses, like I think they're called Pontarlier glasses, or some places are called that, but not always. And they just are these like highballs. And usually they have a stem on them, and you sit them underneath your absinthe fountain, and they have like the perfect little circumference where you can rest a spoon that has a little slot on it, or rest a brouilleur, which has these little cloth things to sit on top. And then you drip cold water slowly, and it looshes, and you get it to the right place. Usually it's like 4-to-1, depending on the proof of your absinthe. And then you sip it, and it's not like overpowering. It doesn't burn your mouth out because it's at the proper level of sipping, and it's delicious, as you know.
Yeah.
Was that enough?
Yeah. That's actually an interesting point too with absinthe is that, well, one, the louche, you're talking about this like cloudiness.
Mm-hmm.
If you've never seen that, it's a really cool phenomenon, and especially in the right lighting, I think is one of the reasons why maybe absinthe has this like mystical quality, because it looks like it can be glowing in the right lighting because of this cloudiness. But the other thing is, absinthe is very high proof. It's like what, 60 to 75, 68, 75%. It could be very high alcohol content, right?
Oh yeah, it's usually in the 60s and 70s, and it depends. Like I've seen some that are a little less, but they're usually in the 60s and 70s, and they can go even higher.
Yeah, but I think the point that a lot of people get is you're like never drinking that straight, right? You're watering it down, and then it's probably more like I don't know what the alcohol content once it's watered down is. It's like not much more than a glass of wine, probably, or maybe a little bit higher.
That's the trick. That's the trick for all over the world is a glass of wine and a bottle of beer and 1 shot of high proof spirit, and then 1 shot of absinthe, which is usually an ounce, not an ounce and a half when you dilute it, and it all comes to like the same ABV.
Very interesting. So going back to that heavy metal bar, they have these little things which I don't think I've ever seen before. Maybe you know it. It was like a little like metal cup that had a very tiny hole at the bottom, so that the absinthe would drip out this tiny hole, and that's how they served it. So they like basically just stuck the cup in front and like dumped all the shot in, and it dripped like that.
Yeah, that's the brouilleur that I was talking about earlier.
This didn't have an action.
Oh, it didn't have a seesaw thing to it?
Yeah.
I think it's all part of the same family. I have one with a seesaw, which is fun because then it goes back and forth. But it can if it drips slowly, then it's just another drip.
Yeah.
And it's all about dripping water. I think people get confused that you're putting like absinthe in the fountain or in the cup, but it's actually, no, the absinthe goes in the glass, and then you drip water on top of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Do you have anything else to say about Wormwood?
I guess that there's so many different variations, and like we talked about how the Artemisium absinthium and the Grand Wormwood is like the one that's the key component for absinthe. But wormwood, like you mentioned, mugwort, and then on the Alps it can grow like in these higher altitudes, and that actually people don't really know what the plant tastes like, but it tastes closer to what genepi is than what absinthe is, because absinthe is mostly about that anise.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Very good.
The green fairy who lives in the absence wants your soul. But you are safe with me.
Thank you for explaining to me more about Wormwood. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love to hear about your plant.
Okay, so I was, I'm always trying to pick plants for my guests that kind of go with the guest, and since you are a master of spirits, I chose a plant that is related to spirits, and I'm going to start off explaining about the plant a little bit, and then I'll tell you about why it's meaningful to me, because it is like more of alcohol-related reason than it is necessarily specific plant-related reason.
Okay, great.
So the plant that I chose is the plum, which is a bit, of a very common plant. I like thinking of plants that are very common, but then kind of getting into the interesting things about them. The very first thing I learned about plum was that it is maybe the very first domesticated fruit, which is quite interesting.
Oh.
And they know that because the three main species of plum, and so the genus for plum is Prunus, which makes sense because dried plums are prunes, the name's all related. But the three main species, which are Prunus domestica, Prunus salicina, and Prunus simoni, none of those can be seen in the wild. So that means that they've been domesticated for a very long time.
Oh.
And there are wild plums that exist, but those three apparently have only the only evidence of them is cultivated. Prunus domestica is from Eastern Europe, and then the other two are from China. And there are lots of other varieties as well, including there is an American plum, but I'm not going to talk about that today because that might come to another episode later.
Okay.
So I'm talking about those European and Asian plums, and those are the ones that we mostly know in the store. They are a drupe, which I talked about in another episode, which is a classification of fruit, which is basically stone fruits are drupes. So, peaches, plums, apricots. If you ever look at a plum, often they look like they have this like white layer of dust on them. You know what I'm talking about? Like they look kind of like
Yes.
cloudy.
Yeah.
That is something that I just learned about called epicuticular wax, which is apparently most plants have some kind of wax, but on a plum, it's particularly apparent. I think they produce a bit more of it than other plants, but also because of that dark color of the skin, you can see it. And it's naturally produced wax by the fruit, which apparently many plants produce some kind of wax like that, but it's particularly apparent on the plum and gives it that beautiful look, which makes it look really great in like old-fashioned still life paintings that like when they really nail that waxy bloom is what it's also called. So then I started thinking about prunes, and I was like, yeah, I don't think I have had a good appreciation for prunes. So I actually bought some the other day and been having them for dessert. They're really tasty. And I started reading about prunes, and I normally avoid just reading straight from Wikipedia, but there's two quotes from prunes that I thought was pretty interesting. One is there's a section in the prune Wikipedia that just says name change. And then it says, in 2001, plum growers in the United States were authorized by the Food and Drug Administration to call prunes dried plums due to the perception that prunes relieve constipation and perceived as derogatory. So some distributors stopped using the word prune and started calling them dried plums because, yeah, it's weird that prunes have this perception that they're like stop constipation, which I guess apparently they do. There's another quote in the Wikipedia that says the European Food and Safety Authority put out a report that demonstrates that prunes effectively contribute to maintenance of normal bowel function in the general population if consumed in quantities of at least 100 grams per day. So there you go. But it shouldn't be bad. It's a good thing. I don't know why.
It's a great thing.
Yeah. So have your prunes. Like most stone fruit, this is true for peaches as well. There's kind of two main styles, and there's clingstone prunes or clingstone plums and freestone plums. And that has to do with how that seed in the middle, a clingstone, it's hard to get the seed off of the plum, and a freestone, it's very easy. And because of that, the clingstone ones are normally the ones that you eat fresh from the supermarket, and the freestone ones are normally used for prunes because you can get that seed out and dry it better.
Oh.
So it's an interesting little fact. When it comes to prune production, China is the number one country for did I say prunes? Plums. Prunes are dried plums. China is the number one country for producing plums, but in like it's the source is a little bit different, but pretty close in the second to third or fourth place, and actually basically on par with the United States, which is surprising for the size, is Romania. Romania is one of the biggest producers of plums in the world, and that's where my personal story comes in because I've been to Romania a number of times.
Oh.
I'm a big fan of Romania, and Romania produces a lot of plums, but they don't export many because they use most of it to make plum brandy.
Right. I was like wondering where we were going to get to plum brandy.
Indeed. And I learned just recently, you probably know this, that the word brandy comes from a Dutch word, which is brandywine, which means burnt wine, which is essentially brandy. You're taking wine and you're distilling it. So you're putting it on a fire.
Yes.
You're distilling the alcohol out. But in Romania, there's two words they use for distilled plum spirits. They actually can do it with other fruits as well, but plum is the most common. And I think it's because the sugars in plum make it it's easier to do than other fruits. But the two words are tsuika, which actually starts with a T with the little dangly on it that they use in Romania, or palinka. And palinka is actually a word that's common in a lot of those Eastern European languages. The main difference between tsuika and palinka is tsuika is single distilled and palinka is at least double distilled. And Suica is like apparently pretty common to like people make it in their homes. People have little like stovetop distilling mechanisms. And I've actually the first time I was in Romania, we were staying at this Airbnb situation, and we had this beautiful smell. And the guy who was the host said, "Oh yeah, that's my grandma making Suica on the stove." So it's like a pretty common thing that people make. Palinka is a little bit more specialized, and you need better equipment, and it's a double distilled process, but getting into my story of like why this means something to me is I once found myself getting a tour of kind of like, I don't know if it was bootleg, but it was definitely not like the most like above board Palinka distillery. It was like in a small town. It was in the back of this lot where they were also like there was like these old guys hand chiseling cobblestones, and they were making all sorts of stuff on this property. But in the back corner, there was this little hut, and the distiller there was giving us a tour of this facility where they make it, and it's a really cool process. It's super simple. Essentially, they take all the plums during the harvest season, and they just put them in a big bucket and they like smash them up, right? And then they just let it distill. It just distills naturally. There's no like added sugar. There's no added yeast.
You mean ferment?
Ferment. Sorry.
That's fine.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, you're right. I meant ferment. It just ferments naturally. Mm-hmm. They don't add any yeast. They don't add any sugar. It's just there. They let it ferment, and then they strain out all of the chunks and stuff, and then they bring it into the still. And the still that I saw was really beautiful. It was made out of all copper. It was hand hammered, and there was two stills. There was a big one and a smaller one for the two steps in the process. And the one thing that I found really interesting is that they would in the big one they would take off this like little like hatch to pour the wine in, the plum wine, and then they would put it back on. But to seal it so none of the distillate escaped or only went out the pipe they wanted to, they made a paste out of wheat, and they would cover any seams with this wheat paste that you would have to then break again anytime that you like wanted to get into it. And the second still, the much smaller still, it was actually in two pieces, and you basically would have to take the entire top piece off to put the next level of distilled wine into, and then seal that whole thing again with this like wheat paste mixture, which I thought was really interesting. And then they would do this double distillation. I asked them about the process of taking out the heads and the tails, which about distilling, that you only want the middle part that's coming out in the distillation, because the first part and the last part are like not good for you. Different alcohol,
generally more poisonous.
Yeah, and so they said that they kept, I think it was the heads. They would reserve the heads and use it for cleaning. They would like use it, like put it in a spray bottle with water and use it to clean stuff, which is that's pretty good.
Great.
And then after they talked us through this whole process, the owner of the property invited us to have lunch, where we were served some palinka, also some homemade cheese and some homemade charcuterie, and then of course I had to buy some palinka. And this is a really common thing in Romania. You don't find palinka in like the liquor store in glass bottles. You only buy palinka in reused soda bottles. Like that's the thing. Like, and so it comes in these like, whatever bottles they have, and that's how you buy it in like the, 1.5 liter bottle. So we bought some of that, and then, but to go home, to fly back home, I didn't want to bring it in a plastic bottle. I felt like that was like too dangerous. So I went and bought these little glass spring water bottles, and I put it in there, and I thought it was very appropriate because the name of the brand of water was Aqua Carpatica, which means Carpathian water. Nice. And I was like, oh, that's actually plum brandy is probably more accurate to be Carpathian water. It's pretty common. One other little story about the brandy that I thought was very entertaining is some friends I know there were in Germany for some kind of event, and they brought some Palinka with them. And after, like, it was like an event, but afterwards they were like sitting around this table in this like conference space drinking Palinka. I wasn't there, but this is a story that was told. Drinking Palinka, having fun, but they left the bottle on the table, and it was also in like a water bottle, right? So it was brought up in like a water bottle. That's how you do it.
Uh-oh.
And then the next day, they came back to the conference space a little bit later, and the bottle was still on the table, but there was a note on it that just said "not water."
Nope.
Which is good. So when I heard that story, I took a little picture like that and sent it to them when I got home, just as a joke of like "not water." And then one last little thing, maybe to tie us back to Switzerland and absinthe, but not absinthe, but alcohol in Switzerland. When I lived in Switzerland, I learned about a really great drink that is called a Schumli Flumli. Have you ever heard of a Schumli Flumli?
Oh, no, I haven't.
So this is a very Swiss word. Swiss German has a particular sound to it. And the actual words in High German are Schaume and Pflaume. Schaume or Schaumen maybe means whipped cream. And Pflaume is the German word for plum. And so a Schumli Flumli is whipped cream, plum. And it's basically, it's a coffee with plum brandy and whipped cream on top. And it's a great thing to have after you're skiing in the mountains. You can order yourself a Schumli Flumli. Warms you right up.
Nice. Part of the après-ski world of drinks.
Yeah, après-ski, that's a good one. I love it. So anyway, that's my story about plums, and more particularly plum brandy. And I still have a little bit of that remaining brandy left. I haven't been to Romania in a while, but hopefully I'll get some again. And there's other countries make good plum brandy.
Oh
too.
yeah, one of the first times I had plum brandy was in college from my Serbian friend.
Oh yeah, I bet you that's also really good.
That was cool.
Yeah, do you have like any like go-to drinks that have like that's not? I can't think. It's not super common in like cocktails, is it? Plum brandy.
Oh no, it's not. But that's the whole thing about the category of eau de vies, which are these brandies, right? Made basically fermented and distilled fruit that is not grapes, because brandy technically is grapes. But so we say eau de vie instead to be talking about fruits that are not grapes. And I did create like a Ricky with a plum brandy or plum eau de vie once, and that was fun. So it was just. But I incorporated some grape juice, used the plum brandy as a base, fresh lime, and then some like high mineral content water for bubbles.
Cool.
But it's not common, but eau de vies in general in cocktails are not super common.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess people like to drink them more straight, I guess. Like, yeah.
They're also expensive, mostly.
Okay.
Unless you smuggle them back in a plastic or water bottle.
Yeah, indeed. Cool. Well, yeah, that's what I got to say about plums.
Nice. I love it. I love plums.
This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. A poem by William Carlos Williams.
Things might sound a little bit different here because I'm at a bar, and Chantal is behind the bar now, and she's going to be making some drinks, and we're going to get some orders in. You were going to get something? Sorry to interrupt you, Mark.
So, Chantal, I was wondering, among your absinthe selections, which would go best with the aloe liqueur option?
Ooh, well, we just actually did one over here for Sherry.
Okay.
The aloe was really pretty and light, and
So this is an absinthe night right now. This is a special evening that happens whenever there's a fifth Thursday in the month. It's called the Fifth Column, and it's absinthe related. So it's a very absinthe themed evening, and that's why I decided to record here this evening.
highlight the herbal, like the herbal sweet quality. I mean, what did we decide? What did you have? You had
The one that you said was more herbaceous and green.
Okay, so my friend Mark just ordered the View Pontalier Absinthe Vert with the aloe liqueur. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's called the Charo Aloe Liqueur. I can show you the bottle.
Yeah, show me the bottle. The audience loves to see things on podcasts.
To describe it.
It's pretty neat. It's just very fresh and aloe-like. I mean, it's just very, it smells like aloe, tastes like aloe, and it's sweet.
So I am going to order the Death in the Afternoon on a Plum Fine Evening, which correct me if I'm wrong here, Chantal, the Death in the Afternoon is a drink that was invented by Hemingway, or at least that's the story.
That is true.
And that is a drink that is absinthe and champagne.
Yes.
But you...
Oh yeah, purported, developed, created by Ernest Hemingway when he was on his boat. The Pilar, I think it was called.
And he was just traveling around with a bunch of absinthe and champagne, and was like, this is the cocktail for me.
Oh yeah. I mean, he developed all kinds of tastes for things, including sherry when he was in Spain, and then absinthe, which is very European, like everywhere in Europe, right? And also in Middle Eastern areas, all the anise flavors. And it was part of the norm, like, versus here in the U.S., you know, people don't find anise so friendly. It's not something we grew up with. We grew up with thinking it's gross, but it's actually quite lovely. So he created Death in the Afternoon, and that kind of is the story behind it. He was on his boat. He drank a lot on that boat.
But this is the Death in the Afternoon on a plum fine evening, and it's because this is a special cocktail inspired by our episode, which is, you know, an absinthe and champagne, but it has plum brandy in it as well, which is very cool. This is what's the story behind this plum brandy?
Oh, also known as Slivovitz. I'm probably saying it wrong. It's actually an American producer, Clear Creek. They're out West Coast, and they create all kinds of eau de vies. They're one of probably the most famous and original like eau de vie producers. They've done all kinds of different flavors, and I tried their blue plum or also Slivovitz way back in the 2010s maybe, and I enjoyed it so much I included it in a couple cocktails. So we had a half a bottle lying around, and I was like, perfect, we can put this in a cocktail for this event.
Well, I'm very excited to try this. I don't think I've ever had a cocktail with absinthe and plum brandy in it, so I'm very looking forward to it. And thank you for creating such a cool cocktail. I'll put a picture of this on the blog when the episode comes out. So Chantal has just made a very nice twist of lemon. It looks beautiful, and the cocktail is on its way. Oh man, the twisting that's going on now. You should see it. It's impressive. Yeah, it's you've never seen such high quality lemon twisting unless you've had a drink served by Chantal. And here it comes, the wonderful Death in the Afternoon on a plum fine evening. Thank you very much. Cheers, everybody. My guest on today's episode of Rootbound was Chantal Sang. Chantal is a bartender, a certified sommelier, and a certified sherry educator. You can learn more about Chantal and all of the cool events she puts on and classes she holds and other places she's tending bar at her website, which is cocktailsforintimes.com. Yeah, Chantal, she knows a lot about fermented beverages. Rootbound is hosted by Steve Ellington, that is me. Music by Christian Kriegeskota, fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, head out to the bar and order yourself up a glass of your favorite fermented plant sugars.
Celery! It's aromatic.